Okay, the Shrewsbury Historical Society tonight will present Dr. Joseph Warren, the American Revolution's Lost Hero. About the program, Dr. Joseph Warren's resistant activities against what he viewed as oppressive British policies led one British commander to declare that Warren was the greatest incendiary of all America. Following Warren's death at the Battle of Bunker Hill in 1775, his martyrdom quickly overshadowed his contributions to the American independence. We will explore Warren's pivotal role and deconstruct how and why this popular founding grandfather fell from glory into obscurity. Something about the presenter. Christian DiSpigna is the author of Founding Martyr, The Life and Death of Dr. Joseph Warren, the American Revolution's Lost Hero. He is the executive director of the Dr. Joseph Warren Foundation and serves on the board of Bunker Hill Monument Foundation. Thank you very much.
Well, thanks for joining us tonight. Tonight we're going to be talking about Dr. Joseph Warren, a figure who has traditionally really not been recognized, and he really needs to be because he is amongst one of the original founding fathers. So let's start tonight with a brief précis of what we're going to be talking about. We're going to be talking about why Warren was so important, why his memory is not cherished and remembered, what happened to his legacy, why it fell into obscurity. So I'd like to start with this slide. And usually when you see anything that talks about the founding fathers, any images, you'll see the usual suspects, right? George Washington, Benjamin Franklin, John Adams, Thomas Jefferson. You rarely see Dr. Joseph Warren. Now, I want you to keep one thing in mind. If you take nothing away from this presentation, just remember that before there was George Washington, there was Dr. Joseph Warren. And I will get into this in a little bit. But let's go over the laundry list, right? Why was Warren so important? Well, here's some of the broad strokes of why he's so pivotal to the rebellion and ultimately the revolution, okay? He becomes president of the Massachusetts Provincial Congress, which is essentially the illegal government of Massachusetts. He becomes head of its Committee of Safety. He becomes the Grand Master of Ancient Scottish Rite Masons throughout North America. He authors the Suffolk Resolves, which is a seminal, pivotal document, and had he done nothing else, we would owe him an enormous debt of gratitude just for that alone. He's at the head of a vast intelligence network. He's conducting spying activities. He's appointed a major general 3 days before the Battle of Bunker Hill in 1775. He's involved in every major battle and skirmish between the period of Lexington and Concord and Bunker Hill and what historians have come to call the 60 days, okay? He's writing polemical arguments, political tracts. He's spearheading the committees of correspondence, the non-importation agreements. He delivers 2 fiery Boston Massacre orations, and he's involved in every major insurrectionary event between the Stamp Act riots and the Battle of Bunker Hill. So this decade period on the road to independence. Now, really to start at the beginning, I feel we need to go to the end, which was the height of his legacy, and this is 100 years after the Battle of Bunker Hill, June 17th, 1875. 350,000 people descend on the city of Boston to celebrate Warren and his fallen comrades on the centennial anniversary. Now, this is an important moment, not just for the celebration of Warren, but it's a healing moment in the nation because this is the first time since the beginning of the Civil War that Northern and Southern troops are marching in unison. So again, it's a healing moment for the nation. They're coming to celebrate Warren, but really after this, his legacy falls into obscurity. Now, anytime we can get a hold of an image, it's very exciting because obviously all we have from the revolutionary period are paintings. Now, this was actually taken, this picture, on June 17th, 1875, and you can see how many people are marching in the parade. Again, 350,000 people celebrating Joseph Warren. Now, Warren comes from a humble background, right? He grows up in Roxbury, Massachusetts. He's the son of a farmer who harvests apple trees. Now, there's a few reasons as to why Joseph Warren decides to cast his lot with the Patriot Whigs and not the Loyalists. And 2 of those issues are the land bank conflict and a book that his grandfather had written. Now, we're not going to get into too much detail about this, but basically the land bank conflict was a currency issue, because at the time in the late 1730s, early 1740s, there's a shortage of hard currency. And so a bunch of farmers, some merchants get together, tradesmen, and they start making paper currency backed by land. But this is in contradiction to the wealthy merchants and elites of the colony, so they reach out to Parliament for help in dissolving the land bank. Now, this is important because a lot of historians point to Samuel Adams' radicalism based on this land bank conflict, because his father was one of the principal investors in this, and his father becomes financially ruined. But what we didn't know before this was Joseph Warren's grandfather was also a principal investor in this land bank. And for 20 years, his grandfather's hauled into court. He's facing numerous lawsuits. He has to sell a lot of his property, personal possessions. Now, Warren would have seen this growing up, and it's one of the reasons why I think that he does cast his lot with the Patriot Whigs, because by all rights, when you read all the primary sources, all the documents, Warren really would have done better had he stayed loyal to the crown, at least financially. Now, how does someone who is the son of a humble Roxbury farmer really turn into one of the most powerful people in the Bay Colony and really throughout the colonies? Well, the answer is education. So in 1755, Warren enters Harvard as a freshman. Now, just to give you an idea about where he ranks, at Harvard, the class rank system is based on the social standing of the students' parents. Now, in a class of 45 entering freshmen, Warren is ranked 31. So you could see he's at the bottom of this social ladder. Now, here's a sketch of Harvard, of what it would have looked like at the time. We have various sources talking about Warren being a prankster and pulling various jokes on his classmates, a little bit of a daredevil. But really, this is where Warren thrives, right? This becomes his social oasis when he enters Harvard. But during his freshman year, Warren returns home to the farm on the first vacation in October, and while his father is picking apples from one of the trees, he falls, breaks his neck, and dies. Now, Warren did not want to return to school after that. He wanted to stay and help on the farm, but his mother insists that he go back and get his education. Now, this picture is from actually one of the descendants' farms, and this is an actual Warren russet apple tree. So, you know, you could still find these apples in October throughout New England. But one of the important things about this, and I mention it because this is prior to my publishing this book, every book, magazine, periodical, article for the past 120 some odd years claims that Warren's direct descendants died out at some point in the late 19th century. But there are plenty, dozens as a matter of fact, alive and well, and I jokingly say I discovered them. But there's about a few dozen of them, and they were so generous to me, opened their homes, showed me all their family heirlooms and treasures, material culture pieces, primary source documents. So it really allowed me to deconstruct this project in a way that had never been done before, because so many things written on Warren don't talk about his early life. A lot of his personal papers were destroyed, and a lot of the things out there on Warren basically talk about his political career, not so much about his personal life. Now, this is one of the rare images you will ever see of Dr. Joseph Warren dressed as a Mason. And this painting is actually in the Joseph Warren Soley Lodge in Lincoln, Massachusetts. It was painted in 1825 by Brother William Swain. Now, when Warren graduates from Harvard, he leaves that social oasis. And so what he does is he gravitates to the world of Freemasonry. And this is going to have major consequences for the rebellion. This is where he meets men like Paul Revere and John Hancock. Now, when Warren decides to become a doctor, there's no medical schools in the colonies at this time. So there's two routes to becoming a doctor. One, you can train over in the glittering capitals of Europe under a trained physician. If you don't have the finances to do that, you train under a physician in the colonies who did their training overseas. Now, Warren chooses his mentor wisely, Dr. James Lloyd, okay? Now, Lloyd did his apprenticeship over in Europe. He comes back with some of the most up-to-date medical techniques. Lloyd is very wealthy, socially connected. He's friends with men like General Howe, Lord Hugh Percy. Now, this is important because we know Warren's father dies several years before this, so this is really Warren's first mentor, not Samuel Adams, because This is where Warren learns how to become a gentleman, how to entertain, how to dress. He's not only just learning how to master the nuances of a bedside manner, but he's learning the best, most up-to-date medical techniques that Lloyd has brought back to the colonies with him, such as smallpox inoculations, obstetrical care. Now, talking about obstetrical care, this print is from the mid-18th century, and you could see that usually obstetrical care is handled by midwives, but now Lloyd and Warren are handling obstetrical care. So again, this is a new procedure that they're kind of on the front lines of, and this is going to, again, have consequences. But let's fast forward, 1764, Warren has finished his apprenticeship, and tragedy strikes. Smallpox, another outbreak in Boston in 1764, and it's so deadly that year that 10 of the first 11 people die from it. Now, what happens is Warren, along with about a dozen other doctors, set up shop in Castle William, which is out in the harbor of Boston, and they begin smallpox inoculations. Now, this is where Warren first meets John Adams. This is the earliest description we have of Warren. And really think about it, right? I mean, there's so many parallels to 1764 and 2020. Warren inoculates over 100 patients and not one of them die. So immediately, Warren is sort of catapulted to this hero status. And if we think about it, who are the heroes at this time in the colonies, right? There's no comic book figures or movie stars. It's usually military figures or nobility. But now it's these doctors. And when you look at the newspapers from this time, they're thanking the doctors for saving the town of Boston from pending doom and saving lives. And so this is where Warren really begins his rise to prominence. And, you know, we talk about smallpox. This was particularly heavy on the minds of the colonists. We know that George Washington contracts it in the 1750s when he's in Barbados. But this is a painting that was painted by Charles Wilson Peale, and it's of his wife and his daughter. And his daughter dies from smallpox. And I mean, here's a picture from the early 20th century. The boy on the left has not been inoculated, but the boy on the right has been. So you could see, not only could smallpox leave you scarred, possibly blind, but it could kill you. So again, when Warren is doing these inoculations with the other doctors, this is where he rises to the forefront of society. Now, once the smallpox epidemic subsides, Warren marries a woman named Elizabeth Houghton Warren. Now, this painting is in the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston, and for centuries, we've been told that it was painted by John Copley. It wasn't. We found proof that it was actually painted by his half-brother, Henry Pelham. Why do we mention this? Well, other than the fact that it corrects the historical record, this kind of extends Warren's social circle, right? Because Henry Pelham, John Copley, these men are devoted loyalists who remain loyal to the crown throughout their life. So we're actually seeing Warren straddling both sides of the political divide, right? He's got a foot in the loyalist circle, and he's got a foot in the Whig circle. Now, this is also important because a lot of historians have claimed that Warren only marries her for financial gain because her father was a wealthy merchant. Nothing could be further from the truth. We'll get to that. We've also proven that wrong. Now, this painting was painted by John Copley, and it's the only original image that we have of Dr. Joseph Warren. Now, again, the question, why does Warren join these loyalists when he's getting so much financial patronage from, he's actually getting the financial patronage from the loyalists? Why isn't he joining the Whigs? Well, there's a few reasons, right? So Warren has a relationship with Royal Governor Thomas Hutchinson. Thomas Hutchinson helped settle the probate will of his father's estate. Warren is given the position as the almshouse physician for the town of Boston for 3 years, where he earns over £1,000. When there's a horrific bankruptcy that threatens to topple the economy in Boston in 1765, Warren is appointed as one of the administrators to the estate of Nathaniel Wheelwright, who went bankrupt, and this has a domino effect, really putting a strain on Boston's economic situation. Now, Warren had no business getting this appointment to that administration of the estate because he's not a lawyer, he's a physician. But again, Warren is receiving all this financial patronage from these loyalists, and you think if he would have joined the Whig cause, it's really the equivalent of financial suicide for him. Now, when he enters this orbit of Whig radicalism, we've always been told that Warren's mentor was Samuel Adams, right? That he's the one holding all the strings. But I've always questioned that because I've never found anything that says, well, where did they meet? Why was Adams his mentor? What's the situation? Because when you think about it, when Warren enters this orbit of Whig radicalism, he's already heavily entrenched in his radical philosophies and his ideology. Now, here's a little bit of a clue. This is a page from Joseph Warren's medical ledger that's in the Massachusetts Historical Society. Here's an entry from 1768 where he's treating Samuel Adams, and if you look at the top of the screen where he writes his name, he misspells it. He writes it as A-D-A-M-E-S. Now, this is 1768 June. Think of the Liberty Affair. This is 3 years after the Stamp Act riots. This is 4 years after the smallpox outbreak. If Samuel Adams was such a devout mentor to Warren, you would think he would know how to spell his name correctly. But even putting that aside, if you look next to that, he addresses in the ledger, he gives Adams the title as Speaker of the Honorable House of Representatives. Here's the problem. Samuel Adams was never the Speaker of the House. He was the clerk. So my point is, if these two men were this close, Warren would have known that. So not only does he spell his name wrong, he gives him the wrong title. So the point being is not to detract from Samuel Adams. There's no doubt that he was a political mentor to Warren. But let's give Warren a little credit when he enters this orbit of Whig radicalism, that, again, he's already heavily entrenched in his Whig ideology, which can date back, again, to the land bank controversy that financially ruins his grandfather, okay? And here's another issue. Samuel Adams obviously falls into debt because he wasn't doing well on his tax collections. Warren is one of 12 gentlemen who donate money to Samuel Adams to get him out of his debt. I believe he donates almost 20 pounds to Samuel Adams. So again, these men are a little bit more on an equal footing, right? They're both Harvard graduates, but Warren is a gentleman scholar. He's a physician. He's healing patients. He's got a reputation in the town. He's well-dressed. He's well-educated. So again, when Warren enters this movement, he brings his own ideas with him. Now, this was great because two of Warren's medical ledgers have been missing for centuries, and we were fortunate to buy a piece of his ledger at auction several years ago. And this is important because not only does it prove the existence of these missing ledgers, but if you look at the third line, Christopher Monk visit and dressing. Christopher Monk was the sixth victim of the Boston Massacre. He's hit the night of March 5th, 1770, but malingers for a decade from his wounds, which he eventually succumbs to. And you see that Warren is treating Christopher Monk gratis, free of charge, as he does for a lot of his other patients in the town of Boston. So this is important because now people are not only putting themselves in Warren's medical care, listening to his advice, but they're also listening to his political views and adhering to some of his political advice. Now, this is another fascinating document, okay? This is was from the Boston Public Library. So we didn't even know where Warren lived, right? It was speculated that he lived on Hanover Street. We didn't know where he lived for the first, 10 years before that when he graduates Harvard. But here's something interesting, right? So we found out that Warren was actually having a custom home built in West Boston. And there's pages and pages of custom work that's being done. And what can we tell from these documents, right? Look at that top line. It says, to painting a carriage vermilion. So what can that tell us about Warren's personal life? So if someone owned a carriage at this time, they would have been very wealthy. Now, we know now that Warren has a carriage and that's how he's getting around. We didn't even know how he was transporting back then. But here's the smoking gun, vermilion. What does that one color tell us? Well, vermilion is the single most expensive color in the colonies, and it's also high fashion in London. So again, we see a really ostentatious wealth here, and John Hancock had a vermilion colored carriage. So again, you're seeing Warren sort of on this social, political, economic rise to power. Here's one of the few surviving items, and this is one of the problems, right? This is why we don't remember Dr. Joseph Warren so much, because so many of his papers were destroyed. There's no monument, meaning a house. I mean, there's several statues around, but there's no brick and mortar building where he grew up or anything like that. But this is amazing because this is a clock. This clock is in the Lexington Masonic Museum, Scottish Rite Masonic Museum and Library in Lexington, Massachusetts. This clock was owned by Dr. Joseph Warren. We weren't sure if it was owned by him, but we actually found documentation proving that this clock was in his office on the eve of Lexington and Concord. And again, this was a very, very expensive item to have in one's house. So again, you're seeing this social and economic rise. Now, we know that Joseph Warren is very close to John Adams. They first met in 1764 during that smallpox outbreak. But here's one of the few things that give us a keyhole into Warren's world, right? So this is a silver porringer handle, and this was usually given as a baptismal gift. And this is in the possession of the current Warren descendants. And this was given to Joseph Warren by John Adams on the birth of one of his children. And you could see the I, that's actually a J. But again, it's these material culture pieces that just give us puts a little more meat on the bone to have an insight into Warren's world. Now, let's fast forward 1770. We know about the killing of Christopher Sider, and this is really kind of what sets off the Boston Massacre about 10 days later. Now, Warren arrives on the scene when Christopher Sider is killed by a customs commissioner. He performs the autopsy. So again, this would have been a harrowing moment for him because he would have had a child this age. Sider is around 10, 11 years old at the time when he's killed. So let's jump to the Boston Massacre, okay? So we all recognize this engraving. This was engraved by Paul Revere, but it was actually an engraving by Henry Pelham. Henry Pelham being the artist who painted Joseph Warren's wife, Elizabeth Houghton Warren. Now, we know Warren is in Boston on March 5th, 1770, because he signs a court document, and he only lived a couple of blocks from this incident. So he definitely would have been on the scene. But here's what's very important about Warren's involvement in the massacre. He's one of 3 men appointed to prepare an account of the massacre, and over 100 depositions are collected. And many who give those accounts to Warren have ties to him, either their friends, political associates, old classmates. But they put this pamphlet together sort of as a propaganda coup to get the news about the massacre to London before the British version of events can get there. And they're very successful in doing this. So Warren has his hands all over this Boston Massacre event. Now, we show this because tragedy strikes Warren in 1773. His wife passes away, and Warren becomes a widower with 4 young children. Now, this is one of the key pieces that tell us that Warren and his wife did not get married for a financial agreement. Now, this is a mourning ring, and usually people had these rings made when someone passed away, and if you had the financial means to do this, you would do it. It was very expensive. Now, we found this picture in the 1875 newspaper that talked about the centennial anniversary of the Bunker Hill battle, and it was referenced as Dr. Joseph Warren's mourning ring for his wife Elizabeth, and Warren's great niece was wearing it at the time. And the amazing thing about this is that it's not just a regular mourning ring, but there's precious stones that surround the mourning scene, which is an urn under a weeping willow. And we had a modern day sketch done of this, and this is exactly what that ring would have looked like, okay? So Warren has this made after his wife passes away. We knew so little about Elizabeth, we didn't even know where she was buried. It turns out she's buried at Copp's Hill Cemetery in Boston, and this has a major consequence on Warren when she dies, and this is why there's really a strong bond between Warren and Paul Revere, because they both lose their fathers as teenagers, and Revere loses his wife the same week as Warren's wife. Now, when Elizabeth dies, this was an incredible thing to find, because we actually have this writing that Joseph Warren puts on paper after she passes, and it reads, "If fading lilies when they droop and die, robbed of each charm that pleased the gazing eye, with sad regret the grieving mind inspire, what then when virtue's brightest lamps expire?" And this is important because, again, we don't have really, John Adams and Abigail Adams, they have a whole treasure trove of letters between them. We don't have any personal letters that survive from Dr. Joseph Warren, and that's why something like this is so important, again, just to get that keyhole into his personal life. Now, let's fast forward to the Boston Tea Party, okay? We all know about the Boston Tea Party, but what's so important is that the Green Dragon Tavern is a planning site for the Boston Tea Party. Now, not only are the Freemasons meeting here, but the Committees of Correspondence meet here, the North End Caucus, the Sons of Liberty. Now, what's so important about this tavern is that they actually call this the headquarters of the American Revolution. So now, 1 week after Warren's wife dies, he throws himself back into the mix and attends the Masonic meeting. And as a matter of fact, I believe he only misses 3 meetings in a span of 6 years, okay? So now, here's a sketch of that Green Dragon Tavern. You can see the Masonic symbolism in the upper left-hand corner. Now, you can read that sketch, and it says, "Where we met to plan the consignment of a few shiploads of tea, December 16th, 1773. And again, Warren misses only 3 Masonic meetings. But history has told us that Warren had nothing to do with the Boston Tea Party, and really nothing could be further from the truth. Now, we're not suggesting that Warren is actually on one of the 3 ships dumping chests of tea, but to suggest that he doesn't have a major hand in planning this event is just ludicrous. Because he's at Old South Meeting House the night of the event, he's giving a speech, and we're supposed to believe that once that meeting concludes at Old South and everyone runs to Griffin's Wharf for those 3 ships, Warren goes home. Again, it's nonsense, but here's another thing that we didn't know. From Joseph Warren's father-in-law, we pulled his probate will, and we saw that Warren inherits half of what's called Houghton's Wharf, okay? Now, this is important because this means Warren really has a direct connection to the seaside population, right? Ship captains, sailors. I mean, this is half his wharf, Houghton's Wharf. Now, what's also important about this is that some of the ship owners, like Francis Roch, John Rowe, these are not only Masonic brethren of Warren's, but they're also patients of his. So again, Warren's fingerprints are all over this event. Warren is chosen as one of the men to try and broker a deal for these shiploads of tea. Now, the tea consignees, the Clarks, the Hutchinsons, these are all friends and acquaintances and patients of Dr. Joseph Warren. Again, remember at this time, the city of Boston is about 15,000 people. It's called a town. It doesn't become a city until later. So again, everybody sort of knows everybody, but Warren's connections run extremely deep, just from his days at Harvard, right? Because he would have been rubbing elbows with the sons of the most powerful people in Massachusetts. Now, in 1774, Warren begins to see another woman. Her name is Mercy Scully. She becomes her fiancée. These are her parents. Now, this is when Parliament passes the coercive acts, right? The intolerable acts. And one of the acts is to shut down the port of Boston on June 1st, 1774, to punish the colonists for the Tea Party until they pay that tea back. Now, we can see that this is a city under siege. This is a 1774 engraving from Paul Revere. Now, this is a serious incident because people are concerned. What are they going to do now that, this is how Boston thrives and lives. This is the heartbeat, right? The port of Boston, and now it's shut. So no importing, no exporting. So Warren writes what's called the Suffolk Resolves, and this is a declaration of rights and grievances against Parliament. Now, keep in mind, 1774, September, this is when the First Continental Congress is meeting in Philadelphia. Samuel Adams, John Hancock. So what Warren does is, after he passes these Suffolk Resolves, he dispatches Paul Revere on one of his lesser famous rides to the Continental Congress in Philadelphia. Revere arrives 6 days after this document has been passed. And really think about what's happening now in Philadelphia, right? There's 56 different delegates assembled from all different parts of the colonies. They're all carting with them their own prejudices. They're viewing Massachusetts as this upstart colony that's causing them all these problems. There's a bitter divisiveness. Once they read these Suffolk Resolves, the entire Continental Congress adopts that document unanimously. And again, there's immediately this harmony amongst the delegates. So that's why when people say, oh, the Founding Fathers didn't know who Dr. Joseph Warren was, it's nonsense. They all knew who he was just from this document. And this document was a precursor document to the Declaration of Independence. When you read the language in this document, it's amazing how many similarities there are to the Declaration. So again, had Warren done nothing else but author this document, we would owe him an enormous debt of gratitude. Now, things start heating up. Again, Warren has a target on his back. The royal officials in the Bay Colony know him well. So he sends his family, his fiancée and his 4 children out to Worcester, Massachusetts in the spring of '75 to get them out of Dodge, okay? Under the care and protection of his friend, Dr. Elijah Dix. Because, again, I think sometimes it's easy for us to look back on these events and think they were predestined or But nobody knew what was happening. You know we have the benefit of hindsight, but at this time it's a very dicey situation. There's a lot of violence, there's tarring and feathering, there's riots. Warren doesn't know what's going to happen, if there's going to be an act of vengeance taking it out on his family. Now, let's get to the famous ride, right? Paul Revere's ride. So now we know that Paul Revere is reporting intelligence to Dr. Joseph Warren. We know he set up an intricate spy ring where he's got all kinds of information being infiltrated and passed to him from Paul Revere and 30 other mechanics who are monitoring British troop movements, from stable boys. There's even a recent book that came out that showed that one of the Mather daughters gave Warren intelligence information from her father and was given strict instructions to give those intelligence papers only to Dr. Joseph Warren. Now, we know that what sends Revere riding into stardom is the Longfellow poem, because usually in the primary source records, you don't really see anything about Paul Revere's ride between 1775 and the 1860s. So why do we call it Paul Revere's ride, right? Paul Revere has been referred to as the Mercury of the American Revolution. And we're finally going to get this right, because we've been told for centuries that on the night of April 18, 1775, Joseph Warren dispatches Paul Revere and William Dawes on their midnight ride from the Green family home that he's renting, that's on Hanover Street. The problem is that Joseph Warren leaves this house in late 1771 and moves to a completely different property while his West Mansion estate is being built. So the starting point of the American Revolution 250 years ago happens from a completely different location than history has told us. Now, these are important things. And when Warren dispatches Revere and Dawes, he does it from the Chardon home, which was said to be at the head of Wings Lane near the Flesh and Fish Market. So again, we're just correcting the historical record after centuries of misinformation. Now let's get down to brass tacks here. The Battle of Bunker Hill. This is the first pitched battle of the American Revolution. And we said that Warren has been the on-the-ground leader for these 60 days, right? This period between Lexington and Concord and Bunker Hill. Now, when the battles of Lexington and Concord happen, when Paul Revere and William Dawes are dispatched on this ride by Dr. Joseph Warren, when Warren finds out that 8 militiamen have been killed on Lexington Green the next morning, he doesn't just sit behind his desk and start writing letters to the Continental Congress. No, he actually goes to Menotomy, which is modern-day Arlington, and he participates in the fighting where he's had a musket ball knock out his hairpin and he was almost killed. He's part of the skirmishes at Noddle's Island, Grapes Island, and now he's participating in Bunker Hill, June 17, 1775. Warren's killed at this battle. And one of the problems we've had with all the histories that talk about Bunker Hill and Warren to this point is when they describe him arriving and sort of being a cheerleader, right? Like he shows up to try and rally the troops. But when Warren shows up, he shows up and he's offered entire command of the battlefield by both General Israel Putnam and Colonel William Prescott, 2 grizzled French and Indian War veterans who are Warren seniors, but they know he's been appointed as a major general to the provincial army 3 days before this battle. But what does Warren do? He does not take command of the field. He says, I'm only here to fight as a volunteer. Tell me where the fighting is going to be the most dangerous, and that's where I'm going to go. Now, when Warren shows up, he doesn't show up with cheerleading pom-poms, right? He shows up with 2 pistols, a musket, and a sword. And he's actively engaged in the fighting that day, tending to the wounded. And when the provincial soldiers see him show up, they all give him cheers of huzzah. The notion of a politician fighting in a battle back then was just as ludicrous as it would be today. So again, these soldiers see Joseph Warren showing up. They all know that he was almost killed at Lexington and Concord. So there's almost this aura of invincibility around him, okay? Now, the sad part is on the 3rd British charge, they penetrate these fortified lines of the redoubt on Breed's Hill, and the Patriots have run out of ammunition. So what happens? There's only one route of retreat, and it's towards Cambridge. Warren stays in that redoubt, fighting till the last seconds to make sure all his men get out alive. Now, this battle turns so brutal that people start throwing stones. It becomes hand-to-hand combat. There's accounts from both sides of the battle talking about how when the British do scale the walls, any wounded patriots on the ground, they're stabbed with the British bayonets, or they're using the breeches of those muskets to beat in their heads. And really think about it, right? So the British have suffered humiliating defeat at Lexington and Concord. They've been defeated at the skirmishes at Noddles and Grapes Island. They've been thwarted. They know Joseph Warren has been a thorn in their side for over a decade. They've watched their commanding officers get picked off one by one on this afternoon as if it was Patriot target practice. When they scale the walls of the redoubt, they don't know that the British have run out of that the Patriots have run out of ammunition. So again, it turns into a bloodbath. This is one of the most brutal battles of the American Revolution, and it also produces the most casualties of any battle throughout the entire American Revolutionary War. Again, this is an incredible thing. Now, when Warren is killed, he is shot through the face and killed immediately. Now, what happens in the following days? There's all kinds of rumors circulating in Boston. Was Warren there? Would someone that important have been at the battle himself? Was he wounded? Was he taken prisoner? Was he killed? Well, when they finally confirmed that he was killed, former Royal Governor Thomas Hutchinson, who's now in England, says about Warren, had he lived, he would have become the Cromwell of North America. And Lieutenant Governor Peter Oliver says, had Warren lived, the name George Washington would have been in obscurity. So these are people that knew Warren intimately from when he was a child. And again, another British commander refers to Warren, not Samuel Adams, as the greatest incendiary in all America. Again, think about Boston, right? This is a microcosm of the rebellion. This is where the major events are happening, and Warren is at the center of all of them. When he delivers his second Boston Massacre oration on March 5th, 1775, the British soldiers are threatening to assassinate anyone who delivers that oration. Warren volunteers to give it, and with nerves of steel sees 5 patients that day before he delivers that oration. Again, he's constantly putting himself at the forefront of danger, and it's something we can fault him for, right? Because he was so valuable to this rebellion that he never should have been on that battlefield. But again, now, when Warren is killed, there's 2 primary source accounts talking about British soldiers decapitating him. We don't know if that's what happened, but what we do know is that his body was horribly mutilated by constant bayonet thrusts. He was stripped of all his clothing. His personal possessions were taken, including a family Bible, intelligence reports that he had on his waistcoat, and he's buried in a shallow ditch next to another patriot, and that's where he stays for 9 months. Now, let's get into the legacy. Let's get into why, if I'm saying Warren is this important, you might be asking yourself, well, if he's this important, why don't we know his name? Why don't we hear about him? Why isn't he mentioned more? Well, there's reasons for that, right? So now, think about it. We remember Warren as this fighting general, but for 10 years, he's been a healing physician, saving lives, right? Helping his patients. But now, he's become this major general, and he's killed at the Battle of Bunker Hill. So now he immediately is catapulted to American martyrdom status. So when we remember Warren at all, it's for one of 2 things. Oh, he's the guy who gets killed at Bunker Hill, or, oh, he's the guy who dispatches Paul Revere on his midnight ride. Now, here's the revolutionary paradox. Think of all the founding fathers, right? Ben Franklin, Thomas Jefferson, George Washington, John Adams, maybe with the exception of Alexander Hamilton. All these men die in their beds as old men, years removed for the Revolution. Warren dies a year before the Declaration of Independence is declared, right? So he kind of exits stage very early on, and he's not part of this later triumphalist phase in American history. He doesn't die as an American citizen. He dies as a traitorous subject to King George III. Now, we said in the beginning, before there was Washington, there was Warren. Let's explain that. So in 1775, who's George Washington in the colonies, right? Well, at this point, for almost 2 decades, he's been a retired colonel from the Virginia Regiment. He hasn't been involved in a military conflict in almost 20 years. Now, keep in mind, let's not look at this from a 21st century mindset, right? We all know who Washington is. We all know Washington's going to become Washington. But who's Washington in 1775? And just to give you an example, when John Adams shows up at the First Continental Congress in Philadelphia in 1774, he writes to one of his friends, I heard the name George Washington today. I never heard this name before. two of the soldiers at Bunker Hill. 2 weeks after Warren's killed at the battle, Washington arrives in Cambridge, and two soldiers write in their diary simply, "A new general arrived today," or "A man by the name of Washington arrived today." So my point is that Washington was not the Washington he was today back then. So when he arrives in Massachusetts, he really has to fill Joseph Warren's shoes, right? Everybody admired and respected Warren. They knew him. He was a gentleman physician, college educated, had a really strong, high status amongst the population in Boston. When Washington arrives, he's a Southerner. Now, Northern-Southern rivalry was nothing new to the Civil War. It was alive and well during the colonial period. So again, when Washington arrives, he has to fill Warren's shoes. And think about a man like Washington, right? His character, his bravery, his courage, his moral, his ethics. How could he not admire Joseph Warren, who he knew from the Suffolk Resolves, knowing he had 4 orphan children, paid the ultimate price on the battlefield, upholding the twin notions of freedom and liberty that Warren had been so assiduously fighting for a decade? How could Washington not emulate those heroics? Warren paid the ultimate price on the battlefield. Now, this one afternoon overshadows Warren's 10 years. Now, when we look at all the depictions of Warren, anytime you see a painting, a photo, anything, he's always depicted as the fighting general, right? Here he is in uniform, another uniform, right? Listed as the generals, Warren, Montgomery, Wayne, and Greene. Here he is in a uniform. He's holding a musket. There he is on the left, holding a musket, Dead on the battlefield next to the sword, holding a musket. Here are the statues, sword, 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 sword. So again, all these depictions of Warren as this fighting general. Meanwhile, he was only a major general for the 3 days before the battle. Again, he spends his entire adult life healing and saving lives, and that's overlooked, as is all his resistance activities for that 10 years. Because again, this one afternoon overshadows everything else. Because again, who are the heroes at this time in the colonies? We said it's either military or nobility. Well, now it's Joseph Warren becomes the first American martyr. And here's part of the problem, right? Even the Battle of Bunker Hill is a misnomer because it took place on Breed's Hill. But then we have a battle that starts to be reduced to jokes and poking fun at it, and how could America lose the Battle of Bunker Hill, right? Well, the first thing is it's a monument to a lost battle, right? So there's the obelisk in Charlestown. The Patriots did not win this battle. They lost. And what statue is outside the obelisk? Colonel William Prescott. Warren's statue is inside, so anyone who comes to that obelisk to see the statue, they see William Prescott front and center, not Joseph Warren. Here's a political cartoon from 1776 in London about the Battle of Bunker Hill, and they call it America's Headdress. I don't know if we remember this cartoon, right? Bunker Hill Bunny with Bugs Bunny. Here's another cartoon from the late 19th century where you have the Patriots atop Breed's Hill, and one of them is holding a jar of beans to throw it down on the ascending British soldiers. There's even a Bunker Hill chili. And here, when we talk about jokes, what was the craziest battle of the American Revolution? The Battle of Bunker's Hill. So again, this battle that again is one of the bloodiest, the one that produces the most casualties of any other battle during the American Revolution, is being poked fun at. And we don't really hear about Warren. Here's a print that I found that Frankenstein was at the battle. I mean, it starts to get very ridiculous. Now, I want to touch on Benedict Arnold for a second, because Arnold comes to Boston right after Lexington and Concord, and he approaches Warren in his capacity as the president of the Massachusetts Provincial Congress, telling Warren that he wants to go to Fort Ticonderoga to capture the cannon that the British have there. Now, Warren, as president of the Massachusetts Provincial Congress, gets Arnold arms, ammunition, money, sends him on his way. Now, Arnold eventually meets up with Ethan Allen. They successfully capture the cannon. These are the cannon that break the siege of Boston in March of 1776, okay? So Warren knew Arnold. Now, we did not know that Arnold gives almost 3,000 pounds to Joseph Warren's fiancée, Mercy Scully, to help raise his orphan children. Now, this is an incredible document we came across, and it's dated July 1780, and this is attached to a 5-page letter that Mercy Scully writes to Benedict Arnold. What's incredible about this is we know that Arnold is a traitor, but it's amazing that a man who's been accused of putting coin over country takes 3,000 pounds of his own money and donates it to Warren. Okay, now that's roughly about $600,000 in today's money. And again, this doesn't exonerate Arnold, but again, it peels back more layers to this onion. Now, Mercy Scully becomes Warren's unofficial widow. They were engaged. And similar to Alexander Hamilton's widow, she lives about 50 years after Warren dies. And when you read her letters in her final years, she's writing about Warren as if he had just passed away. She's still heartbroken. She never marries. There gets a nasty custody battle over the children after Warren passes away. But in one of her last letters, when she writes, "My sands are running low," she realizes she's dying, and she's talking about Warren as if he just died the other day. It's really heartbreaking. But Mercy Scully dies in 1826. But let's get back to the legacy a little bit more. So this is a print we came across, and it's a tribute to Warren. It's from the 1840s, and you could see the 2 columns, and those are the first 8 presidents. Below that, you see George Washington standing in front of 13 soldiers, each to be representing one of the 13 colonies. And if you look at the pictures at the bottom of those pillars, on the left is Dr. Joseph Warren, and on the right is General Lafayette. So you still see Warren being a part of this national conversation, but again, the legacy just over the decades, it starts to fade. And here's another example. On the centennial anniversary of the Battle of Bunker Hill, where Warren gives his life, look at this centennial ribbon. George Washington is on the left, General Lafayette is on the right. Where's Warren? He was at the battle. These 2 men weren't. So again, it's these constant strange anomalies that you can't even figure out as to why Warren is not getting the credit he deserves. This is a picture of Joseph Warren's nephew, John Collins Warren. Now, we know that there is a very impressive medical dynasty that Joseph Warren starts with generations of doctors and Harvard doctors. John Collins Warren is one of the founders of Mass General, New England Journal of Medicine. Joseph Warren's brother, John Warren, was one of the founders of Harvard Medical School. Now, what's incredible about this is that Warren is probably the most migratory corpse of all the founding fathers, okay? He's reburied at least 4 different times over an 8-decade period, and when he's finally buried in 1856, John Collins Warren, his nephew, arranges to have daguerreotype images taken of Warren's skull. And you could clearly see in the middle photo where the fatal bullet, musket ball, hits him and exits through the back of his skull. And I think one of the problems, too, is that Warren is not buried along the Freedom Trail, right? You can't go to Copp's Hill. You can't go to Old Granary Burial Ground. He's buried in Forest Hills at Forest Hill Cemetery in Jamaica Plains, so sort of off the beaten path. Now, Warren has 4 children. He's got 2 sons and 2 daughters. Both his sons die in their early 20s. They have no children. So there's only 1 surviving daughter who has a child, and Warren's current direct descendants all owe their bloodline to this youngest daughter of Joseph Warren, and she has 1 son who survives to adulthood. His youngest daughter, Mary, passes away around the same time that Warren's fiancée dies. That's her headstone in Greenfield, Massachusetts. But again, what we did not know, because we didn't know that the descendants were still alive, is that there's also an impressive military dynasty. Graduates of West Point, commissioned officers, non-commissioned officers. This is a picture of Joseph Warren's 5th great-grandson, Warren Wildrick. He's a Green Beret Special Forces in Vietnam who dies due to Agent Orange complications. So again, there's this incredible military dynasty and an incredible medical dynasty that Warren was at the helm of. Warren's hometown of Roxbury, Massachusetts. This was taken, I believe, in the 40s, and the statue of Joseph Warren is literally in the shadows. There's a tree growing in front of it. This statue was eventually removed, and now it's at Roxbury Latin School, which is Joseph Warren's alma mater. That was the school he was at before Harvard. And I just wanted to touch on the John Adams biography because it was so popular and so many people know this from the miniseries on HBO, but let's do a little comparison between Joseph Warren and John Adams, right? Joseph Warren is 34 years old when he dies, literally days after his 34th birthday. If John Adams had died right after the Declaration of Independence in 1776, right? He would have been 6 years older than Warren, signed the Declaration of Independence. McCullough's biography doesn't even finish the second chapter. That's my point. Again, there's such a small paper trail that we knew so little bit about Warren that all these new discoveries were so momentous because, again, it gives us a clear idea of Warren's personal life and how important he was. Now, we all remember the Disney show, Johnny Tremaine. Walter Coy portrays Dr. Joseph Warren. So you see Warren making a little bit of a comeback in popular culture in the 1950s and 60s. But now, when you ask people about Charlestown, they say, oh, you mean the movie The Town, where they're notorious bank robbers? And again, it just detracts from the history of Charlestown, right? So we have this other pop culture now. There was a miniseries on the Sons of Liberty on the History Channel. I mean, the sets were great, but again, very inaccurate history. And really, once you portray the history as inaccurate on a TV series or a show, it sort of metastasizes itself in the literature, and it's so hard to undo it. This is a huge moment for Dr. Joseph Warren. Regardless of political affiliation, when Ronald Reagan becomes president during his first inaugural address, he refers to Dr. Joseph Warren as a man who might have been one of the greatest amongst the founding fathers. This was in 1981. Reagan quotes, "Our country is in danger, but not to be despaired of. On you depend the fortunes of America. You are to decide the important question on which rests the happiness of millions yet unborn. Act worthy of yourselves." Now, that was a quote directly from Dr. Joseph Warren's second Boston Massacre oration. The play Hamilton, breathing life back into the founders, but again, not really accurate. Now, in 2016, the Freemasons of Massachusetts got together and had this statue made and donated at Warren's final resting place in Forest Hill Cemetery. They've also donated over $500,000 to help with repairs of the obelisk in Charlestown. And the Masons really have become the guardians of Warren's legacy. Now, I always get this question, and it's the great what-if questions in history, right? What if Warren had lived? He surely would have become the first president of the United States, right? My stance on this is that Washington was going to become Washington, regardless. But I often have to sit here and wonder how much easier could Warren have made that assimilation when Washington arrives in Boston, right? We know there's this bitter rivalry and there's prejudice against Massachusetts. There was a famous quote Washington made that called the New Englanders a dirty, nasty rabble. And nobody knew that terrain better than Warren, right? And you just know that Warren could have been so helpful to Washington when he arrives in Cambridge in July of 1775. But, you know, Warren did it all, right? Voice, pen, sword, and scalpel. And really, I would challenge anyone to find another character, another figure from this period of history who had done more than Joseph Warren, right? He wasn't content to sit behind a desk and write letters. He was on the forefront. When the Founding Fathers go to the Continental Congress in Philadelphia, you read the letters they're writing to him, asking him, what's the situation in Boston? And really think about it. Had Warren's intelligence network not tipped him off as to what was happening when British regulars were marching into the countryside of Lexington and Concord, he dispatches Paul Revere and Williams Dawes. Had Warren not done that, would there have been a shot heard around the world? And as a consequence of that, would there have been a Bunker Hill? Would there have been a Declaration of Independence? It's really hard to say, and I don't like to delve into speculative history, but Warren's fingerprints are all over these events. He's the man who sets off the shot heard around the world. He's the one who's participating in Bunker Hill when all the Founding Fathers are in Philadelphia. He is the on-the-ground leader who the Founding Fathers are looking to for advice. I mean, that's why he's so important. But we'll end it here, and this was from 1843 when the obelisk is put up. And this is from a little ribbon, and it's called Immortals. And it's honor to the illustrious dead. Their monument is immortality. And Warren writes these words about a year before he's killed at Bunker Hill, and he writes, when liberty is the prize, who would shun the warfare? Who would stoop to waste a coward thought on life? Again, Warren backed up all his words with actions. He was directly on those battlefields. He was in the churches, delivering Boston, the fiery massacre orations. He's doing it all, writing pamphlets, really vitriolic political arguments, newspaper arguments, getting rid of Governor Royal Bernard. I mean, he's at the center of every major insurrectionary event in and around the town of Boston. And it's just sad that he's not more recognized today. So I will leave it at this. I want to thank you for joining us tonight, and I hope you'll agree with me that Dr. Joseph Warren does really deserve a seat at that table of the Founding Fathers. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Christian. Our next meeting is September 28th, and our program will be Reading Historic Paintings by Tom Kelleher from Old Sturbridge Village. Thank you very much, and we'll see you in September.